The mid-20th century discovery of caches of scrolls in the caves around the Dead Sea gave us a glimpse into the crucible of the Second Temple period of Judaism, specifically into the writings of the mysterious Essenes, an apocalyptic and ascetic Jewish sect with many parallels to early Christianity. Of our ancient sources on the Essenes, the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo actually held them up as exemplars of spiritual and philosophical rigor, leading lives of purity and reflection. However, the paragon of such a life of spiritual contemplation was reserved for a group even more obscure to us now than the Essenes. Living near the large lake southwest of ancient Alexandria, Philo describes a monastic group of men and women whose renunciation of the world allowed them to lead lives of apex spiritual and philosophical practice. Let's explore what little we know about these Therapeutae, whose name means both to worship but also to cure, such that they cure their own souls through their constant worship of the divine through contemplation. So much so that they may have very well laid the foundations for Christian monasticism, a decisively important institution in Western religion. And they might have even been Jewish Buddhist syncretists. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. And also, if you want to support this work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting my work. You can best do that by checking out my Patreon. You can use a one-time donation through PayPal. You can use the handy-dandy super thanks option below the video, or you can pick up some of the merch of our channel down on the store tab. But now, let's travel back to ancient Alexandria, to a long-lost Jewish sect hailed for dedicating their lives to healing their souls through the worship of the Divine One, the Therapeutae. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Our knowledge of the Therapeutae is drawn exclusively from Philo's famed essay on them, most often known as On the Contemplative Life, and is part of a longer discussion on his part about examples of various ancient practitioners of what are called the active and contemplative lives thought ideal by the Stoic, Platonist-infused philosophy that flourished around the time of the Common Era. This distinction of the active versus the contemplative life is actually first introduced in a very confused way in Aristotle, but it basically tracks to two ideal modes of human existence. The active life is an ethical ideal whereby one interacts with the wider world in a beneficent mode such that it encourages overall virtue and thus flourishing, or eudaimonia. The contemplative life, on the other hand, and eventually introduced as a higher ideal than the mere active life by Aristotle, is a life whereby one turns inward and perfects oneself not only morally, but primarily in an intellectual and semi-spiritual mode, thus sharing in the same final causation of, reality itself. Recall that God, the ultimate good for Aristotle, was simply an endlessly thinking thought. It's thought endlessly contemplating itself, luring all of reality to final absolute goodness. Now, Philo, for his part, notes that all cultures produce examples of the practitioners of this true philosophy, the active and the contemplative lives, from the gymnosophists over there in India to the philosophers of the ancient Greeks. But he is wont to make the argument that they too are to be found among his people, the Israelites. Thus he lays out in a largely now lost essay how the Essenes are the Jewish example of those leading the active philosophical life, dedicating themselves to communal living and community discipline meant to ethically, spiritually, and philosophically purify themselves. Now, from what we can tell from the documents actually produced by the Essenes, or at least the ones living down there near the Dead Sea, is that Philo is doing more than a little interpolating of his own Hellenized Stoic Platonic philosophy, those ideals onto the Yachad, as that community called itself. Now, there were probably other Essenes, other than the ones that lived down there on the Dead Sea, but this group, as we know them from their literature, was primarily an apocalyptic Jewish sect, seemingly founded by a spurned priest from the Jerusalem temple who had felt that all of Judaism had become defiled, such that they alone, the Essenes alone, remained the righteous remnant who would be redeemed by God in a final apocalyptic battle, as detailed in the War Scroll, the scroll of the Sons of Light versus the Sons of Darkness. In fact, it's actually pretty difficult to imagine them having anything other than contempt for Hellenistic philosophy, and would have probably had very little nice to say about the syncretizing Jew that was Philo of Alexandria. But rigorous communal living, lives of strict Levitical purity, and constant attention to the service of the divine certainly does seem to have been hallmarks of the sectarian documents discovered near the Dead Sea. And perhaps in this way, Philo doesn't appear to be totally making things up from whole cloth. Thus, we can probably assume that his discussion of the Therapeutae, for Philo, remember, these are the ideal examples of those leading the contemplative life, hence the name of the essay in which he describes them, on the contemplative life, it probably does contain some combination of historical description and a healthy dose of Philo's interpolation. Again, all of this is in the interest of showing to the larger Hellenistic world that his own ethnos, his own people, the Jews, were also world-class philosophers worthy of respect and admiration. The Therapeutae, whose name is functioning a bit like a pun for Philo, means both to worship but also to cure, and taken together, it means something like those that cure their souls through the constant worship of the divine. We learn that this monastic community of both men and women, which is important, there were women here according to Philo, which is unlike the Essenes, which were basically all celibate men, had taken up residence in the placid and healthy region southwest of Alexandria, just north of Lake Mareotis. Unlike Greek philosophers who simply let their estates fall into disrepair after having abandoned them for their lives of dedicated to philosophy, the Therapeutae, on the other hand, very carefully liquidated their estates, justly distributing those funds to people like the poor before retiring to the purely contemplative life. Their community itself was marked by a central ritual building surrounded by small huts, probably just normal mud huts that are typically built in that region. The larger building functions as both a meeting hall but also a dining room for the community and is the site of the most important Therapeutae ritual, which I'll come back to in just a moment. However, during the week and prior to the Sabbath, the Therapeutae dwell in their own cells composed of an inner and outer room. They seem to have primarily lived in the outer room, whereas in the inner room, which Philo introduces a brand new word into Greek to describe, monasterion, which is, to my knowledge, the first appearance of this word in Greek. Monastery. It's a monasterion. This is where each member keeps their collection of sacred writings for study and spiritual reflection. The appearance of that word, monasterion, in discussing the Therapeutae is going to have, well, dramatic effects. It's going to prove decisive. In fact, early Christians, like the 4th century church historian Eusebius, actually mistakenly thought that the Therapeutae were Christian monks. He thought that they were actually Christians described by Philo, an idea that would later be echoed by people like the mystic theologian Pseudo-Dionysius. That early Christians would take from Philo's account of the Therapeutae the very language of dwelling in a monasterion, at least reveals that his account has had exactly the kind of impression he wanted. People wanted to emulate the Therapeutae. They wanted to become monks. Thus, at least in the language of monks and monastery and monastics, the legacy of the Therapeutae oddly survives well into Christianity, if not in Judaism. Judaism ultimately would reject celibacy and any form of monasticism as basic religious values. Now, what were those writings that they kept in the monasterion? Well, we don't know. They were probably what we would now know of as the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint, what Philo calls the text's sacred instructions of the prophet Moses. The word instructions there is probably the Greek translation of the Hebrew Torah, as, well, at least Philo has it. But we also learned the community would compose novel texts and hymns, much like their Essene counterparts, who produced an entire library of religious documents. However, along with what we know that they had in terms of books, we also learn a lot about their hermeneutics, how they read those books. Like their Hellenistic counterparts, and Philo, of course, the Therapeutae would contemplate their sacred and religious writings through allegorical analysis. This kind of esoteric analysis of sacred scripture had actually been pioneered centuries earlier by the Stoics, who, unlike Plato, who wanted to censor on any unbecoming sections of the myths, you can find his arguments for that in the Republic, the Stoics sought to rescue the myths in their totality, the myths of Hesiod and Homer primarily, through allegorical readings which revealed a hidden dimension in them, and thus hidden truths actually encoded in what are otherwise, well, pretty lurid and unethical myths. Philo himself actually applied the allegorical hermeneutic to the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, discovering all kinds of philosophical truths hidden in the biblical narrative. While revolutionary, and there's no doubt this was a revolutionary shift in the practice of reading, the Stoic Philonic esoteric reading of Scripture is decisive in both exoteric and especially esoteric religion and philosophy. We just can't even understand most of these texts in a non-allegorical way these days. Though I have to admit, those texts of Philo are a positive slog if you've ever worked through them. Revolutionary, yes. Convincing or even fun to read, well, you should give them a try. Your mileage might vary. I find them to be just a slog. However, as far as possible Therapeutae text goes, Russell Paul Spittler has actually argued that another text produced around the same time period as Philo, called the Testament of Job, was actually produced by the Therapeutae because of its focus on divine contemplation despite hardship. I mean, it is a retelling of Job after all. It's kind of Job's whole thing. But also the prominent role of women in that text, especially Job's wife, who we actually get a name for her, Thetis, the hymns that are found in the text, and an interest in the number 50. We'll come back to this for the Therapeutae in a moment. There's even an interesting scene where one of Job's daughters actually receives a magical sash that, when she wraps it around her body, allows her to speak and sing in the language of the angels, perhaps paralleling the dream speech of the Therapeutae that I'll talk again about in a second. Now, I can't say that I'm terribly impressed by his arguments that this is a Therapeutae text, but, well, it's worth considering just the same. I mean, he's the expert on the text and certainly not me, so if he says it's a Therapeutae text, well, we should take that pretty seriously. But it seems from Philo that the Therapeutae engaged in esoteric reading of sacred scriptures through allegory, as I mentioned, so much so that they would actually even give philosophical speeches about the nature of the divine while they were dreaming. They would speak while dreaming, giving basically philosophical discourses. Now, the link of communion with the gods through sleep and dreams is a very common motif in the ancient world, but it's interesting here when it occurs among the Therapeutae. As far as their daily practice, it appears that they prayed twice a day, once at sunrise and again at sunset. They fasted until after sundown, associating even eating with the body and its sort of failures. There's a bit of dualism here. And then they only dined on salted bread, sometimes garnished with hyssop, with spring water to drink. The mention of hyssop here is interesting, given its role in exorcistic texts that we have from this time period, but also we know that ancient Egyptian priests were also known to take their bread with hyssop as a condiment as well, so maybe there's an Egyptian connection. In fact, we're told that they were so focused on the divine, they would often just forget to eat for days at a time. They would appear like grasshoppers who could feast on mere air, as Philo has it. Their prayers were, unsurprisingly, for direct spiritual illumination and to be basically quit of all physical sensation for better contemplation of the One. During this period, they would also compose, write, and recite various kinds of hymns. Music, unsurprisingly, played a critical role in their spiritual illumination, as in many religious traditions. As you can probably imagine, their clothes were simple linen shirts in the summer, which they covered over with roof wool or goat skin during the winter. They remained in those huts for 6 days out of the week, secluded in their contemplation. However, for the Sabbath, they gathered together in a common building, men on one side, women on the other, separated by a kind of partition, a mechitza, I suppose, to hear discourses given by a community elder. All the while, they maintained strict rules of modesty, even covering their arms inside their linen garments, kind of mummy-like. The discourses were, of course, given in very simple language, free from any rhetorical flair, though still informed by these allegorical understandings of Scripture, and they were for the sole edification of the community. While there were no slaves in the community, a practice we're actually told by Philo that they despised as abominably unnatural, really a break with all the culture of the time, there was still yet a social hierarchy mostly established by seniority and wisdom in the community. Thus, there was probably some means of initiation into the community, although we don't have much data about that, but we do see something like that in the Essenes, who had an extremely complicated mode of initiation. However, these social differences among the Therapeutae are actually most clearly visible in what was probably the high point of the Therapeutae ritual cycle, the Sabbath of Sabbaths. Every 49th Sabbath Eve, the Therapeutae enjoyed a ritual meal, though still only consisting of bread, salt, water, and hyssop, though some of the elders did get cold spring water, which is apparently a real treat. Though in this case, the younger members actually served the older members who were reclined on rough benches covered over with local papyrus. Again, banquet here is a strong word. Prior to this meal, there would have been a keynote speech given by the leader of the community, followed by the singing of a hymn, either an ancient one or one newly composed. Then came the ritual meal, which I just mentioned, which was meant to be probably an echo of the showbread of the Jerusalem temple. Following that meal, the men and the women gathered in the center of the dining room and led by a choir leader representing both Moses and Miriam, everyone joined into eventually one harmonious singing, dancing, and clapping in increasing ecstatic joy and reverence until the dawn. Now, this is something very unlike their Essene cousins who had a positive horror of something like dancing. Still a horror of mixed dancing out there. On the dawn of the following day, they greeted the sunrise in ecstasy before returning to their cells for another week of contemplation. A great deal of this essay, by the way, is also spent comparing the ascetic banquet of the Therapeutae with the positively, or at least what Philo thinks of as the absolute decadent dining affairs of the Greeks and the Romans. Even the famed symposia attended by Socrates are criticized in the essay in light of the Spartan banquet of the Therapeutae. Spartan banquet of the Therapeutae. I think I mixed my metaphors there. At any rate, Philo is just attempting, as I mentioned earlier, to justify the ways of the Jews to the Hellenistic world, showing that they can not only engage in a fully philosophical way of life, but they can even outdo the Greek philosophical heroes in their life of spiritual and philosophical contemplation. Now, of what other Jewish rituals they partook, or even their relationship to their co-religionists over in Judea, or the temple for that matter, isn't at all clear in this text. Though there were more Jews living in Egypt at this time than in Judea anyhow. Even Philo himself very rarely visited the Jerusalem temple. Indeed, just what kind of Jews these Therapeutae are is, well, it's mysterious. In fact, in an article by Kleinhempel has actually made the argument that the Therapeutae may have been Buddhists, or Jewish Buddhist syncretists, Jewbus, with the actual word Therapeutae just being a corruption of the Pali word Theravada. Now, we do know that there were Buddhist missionaries operating in Egypt, dispatched by people like Ashoka, and they were active in the region. In fact, in 2022, at the southern Egyptian port down there at Berniki, a 71-centimeter statue of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama of blessed memory, was discovered in an Isis temple roughly contemporary to Philo and the Therapeutae, the first such statue of the Buddha found west of Afghanistan in this period. So, there were definitely Buddhists around. Now, I don't personally find this argument terribly compelling, but again, it's out there and it's worth considering, and you can find a link to it in the description to decide for yourself. So, Therapeutae, Theravada, maybe, maybe not, but I mean, there's a lot of Jewbus now. Just some Alexandrian Jewbus in the ancient world. As with Philo's account of the Essenes, it's hard to know what's history and what's philosophical interpolation on the part of Philo, but most scholars accept that the Therapeutae were a real group and at least somewhat in keeping with the description of them found in his essay on the Contemplative Life. Of course, Philo's philosophical works would also come to play a decisive role in later Christian theology. I don't think you can get the Trinity off the ground, frankly, without Philo. But I also suspect that his high praise of the Therapeutae also played an important role in the rise of Christian monasticism, which you'll remember began in Egypt. Recall, even the term monasterion first appears in literature in this essay about the Therapeutae, and then it only reappears much later in Christian patristic literature. Though, with the possible exception of the Testament of Job, again, we only know about the Therapeutae from this brief essay, which itself only survives probably because early Christians thought it was really about them. But if you want to read it, you can easily find a copy of On the Contemplative Life in translation online, though I would say that I think the best edition of it is to be found in the wonderful Philo collection in the volume of the Classics of Western Spirituality series, which is just amazing. I mean, I have a whole shelf of them right there that you can't see. You can typically get it used, and it's great. They're fantastic. You can also get his reflections that survive on the Essenes in that collection as well. I mean, you can typically get it for like a couple of dollars used. While the Essenes are much more famous given the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm going to argue that the mysterious Therapeutae also deserve a bit of attention. And I'm glad that I have the opportunity to do that here at Esoterica. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for coming with me to discuss these wonderful, ancient, lost people, the Therapeutae, here at Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.